extremely fulfilling. So let's go on to our first screen. There we go. So what we'll cover today in our time together, first up, we'll be discussing how to enter this field and where you guys can work. Then we're moving on to what a trust is and the types of trust we deal with. Then I will quickly touch on a few key elements of a valid trust. When then we move on to my main passion, which is deceased estates. I'm going to take a while on deceased estates and pause there, take my time. And then lastly, we'll look at the basics of drafting and understanding wills, because obviously that's the key center of why we have deceased estates and trusts. And then to finish things off, I'll open the floor for some Q&A. So let's move on to our next screen, career opportunities. How do you become an estate and trust practitioner? You don't necessarily need an LLB, but I do know all of you guys are LLB students, and that's why you were joining this mentor program, or also alternatively candidate attorneys. But to become an estate administrator, you don't actually have to have your LLB, but you do need practical training. If this is a field that interests you, I highly recommend that you actually do finish your LLB and then choose a firm for your articles that has a strong deceased estates or fiduciary law department. This will help you guys to build the confidence you need to one day practice for your own account, because that's what we all wish. We all wish to make the most amount of money from our passion or our field that we are going to choose in the end. So places you guys can work when you have a fiduciary background is law firms, obviously our first and foremost, which we can both divide into two sections. We have our boutique law firms that is very small and they usually specialize in only one or two fields. Or we can have a full service law firm, which we actually consider a general practice law firm that also has a division of estate law. I do feel that when you do have a full service law firm, you have more opportunity for growth. Because obviously you can quicker become a manager or someone higher up in that division because of the size of such a law firm. And then we can also consider fiduciary service providers. Examples like this is Sanlam Trust or FNB Fiduciary. And then we can look at banks. It's actually crazy to think that most of our banks that we do our usual banking at every single day, they have their own fiduciary departments. So, for instance, Absa Bank, FNB, Standard Bank, they all have trust departments as well that focus on deceased estates as well. We can also look at financial service providers. Companies like Capital Legacy, they actually specialize in deceased estates, but they are not necessarily a bank or a law firm. And then also a niche field is you can work in an in-house legal department. So for a major company that special or has a corporate trust structure, they can actually give their employees an opportunity to do in-house drafting of their wills. It's a very niche field that we can definitely discuss later. Now, key skills that you need to have when you're working in this field of law, so fiduciary field, is attention to detail, most important. But we also learn that when we do our LLB, because we have to draft a lot of documents, we have to draft our assignments, and that attention to detail that we learn there is a key skill in estate administration. Then we have to have a strong drafting ability, because obviously we have to make sound reasoning to the Master of the High Court, to your beneficiaries, to whoever third parties we need to discuss the reasoning for why we are making certain decisions. Our drafting ability is key there. We also have to have good empathy and communication. Remember, the reason why we are contacted in the first place, specifically focusing on deceased estates and testamentary trust, is because someone died. So you have to not just focus on the fact that this is your normal job in your normal scope of work. You also have to put yourself in the shoes of your client. They just had a great loss, and you need to show sufficient empathy and in obviously the way that you communicate with them as well. Then, the most important part for me as an estate administrator is to have a strong administrative ability. So what I mean there is, do you know how to properly diarize important instructions? What do you prioritize? This is the main part of the administration process, because remember, everything needs to happen in a certain date scope. So for instance, when you get your letters of executorship and you place your first advertisement, we'll get to that later, you have to wait 30 days. Then what happens after that 30 days? Did you remember to diarize this so that you don't forget what to do after your period has lapsed? And then lastly, we have to have familiarity with tax, property, and family law. So we don't just focus on our Wills Act or our Estates Act. We focus on different fields of law that is all applicable to deceased estates and trust and in estate planning. So now we can see that this field offers stability, continuous learning, as we now have to familiarize ourselves with tax, property, family law, and it also gives us the satisfaction of actually making a true change in the world. We are helping people to protect their legacies and move on from this pain that they just experienced. Let's move on to our next slide. What is a trust? A trust is a legal relationship in which one party, which is the trustee, holds and administers property for the benefit of another person, which is the beneficiary of the trust. This trust falls part and is regulated by the Trust Property Control Act 57 of 1988. So there are two types of trust. We have our inter vivos trust, which is also known in layman's terms as a living trust, and that is created while the founder is still alive. Then we have our testamentary trust. These are established in a will and only comes into effect after death. Now, what is the purpose of a trust? The purpose of a trust is to protect our assets, to help us to properly plan for estate duty that comes later, also to help us to ensure long-term financial care for our minors and also our special need dependents, and also to help us to successfully plan for succession as well as our wealth distribution. Now, how do we register a trust? First up, we have to draft a trust deed. Then we have to appoint trustees and obtain their acceptance, which comes in the form of a J417. We will discuss this a bit later. Then we submit the following documents to the Master of the High Court. We have our trust deed, which is our contract that I explained above previously. We have our founder's ID and his details. We need to have the ID documents of the trustees as well as the beneficiaries. Then we also need to submit our J417 and our J450 forms. Now let's pause here so that we can look at the purpose of these forms. So the form J417 is the acceptance of trusteeship. This form is completed by each trustee to formally accept the appointment as trustee, as well as to declare in front of a commissioner of oaths that they are not disqualified from acting as a trustee. Now, when can you be disqualified as a trustee? This is set out in our Trust Property Control Act. So reasons can be, for example, if you are insolvent, if you've been convicted of fraud, or if you've been convicted of any other crime. And then we can move on to our J450. This is the bond of security. Now, bond of securities also take place, or is also a document that we need to submit in our deceased estates. But now for our trust, the bond of security also has the same reason. This form relates to the security a trustee may be required to furnish, like an insurance or financial bond, to ensure proper administration of the trust. So basically, the trustee is telling the Master of the High Court that the Master can trust that he will properly handle the finances of this trust. He will ensure that the money gets more and not less. So then in most family trusts, the requirement for security is actually waived. So we don't actually have to submit the trust, the bond of security, if our trust deed, which is the contract, is properly drafted. If we properly draft that we want to exempt our trustees from submitting a bond of security, then the master can consent to this, considering the trustees, like how they present themselves, like is their financial status up to date, are they properly trusted, are they professional persons. Mostly if a professional party like a chartered accountant or a lawyer is appointed as one of the trustees, the master already has another security that he has with these two parties. For instance, when you're a lawyer, you form part of the LPC, which is the governing body, and they will then, the beneficiaries of the trust can then add another, if they're unhappy with how the lawyer is attending to the trust or administering the trust, they can actually go and lodge a complaint at the LPC. So the master already knows that there is retribution for professional persons. Same can happen with a chartered accountant. They have their own governing body that you can lodge a complaint against. So the master then exempts these types of parties from actually submitting the bond of security. Then, if a bond of security is required, what is that actually? Now, the bond of security is actually a loan that we make at an insurance or a financial bond, where we say, okay, we can see that an amount of, say, 5 million will be held in this trust. For instance, there's a property to the value of 2 million and there is 3 million of cash assets. We then have to submit a loan to the master in an equal amount of 5 million, that is the trust assets, to the master. So if anything happens and trust money is misappropriated, the master will actually ask you to now go and take the money that you loan, but it's actually just a written loan. It's not actually money that goes into the trustee's account. Take out that loan and pay it to the master to once again put the trust back at the place it would have been if the trustee had not misappropriated these funds. Now, that's just a little explanation of the bond of security and the massive responsibility that a trustee actually have, because that money actually gets paid by your own personal capacity. That trustee is personally responsible for the funds in the trust. That is why it's so important not to misappropriate funds. And then once we've now got all of our documents together, we also submit proof of address to the master and our fee payment to register the trust. Then the master will go through all of these documents and you will issue a letters of authority, giving the trustees authority to now go ahead and administer the trust properties and the trust assets. Now let's move on to the important clauses that we need to have in a trust deed. The important clauses include our beneficiaries clause, our powers and duties of trustees clause, our termination of trust clause, our decision-making rules, and how the income and capital will be distributed. Each of these clauses are subject to the creator's own needs and specific purpose of the trust to be created. Now, the reason I'm not actually going into detail about these various clauses is because you can literally Google an example of a trust deed, and you can actually go onto governing bodies' websites to see trust deeds already submitted at the master that's available for public to view, and you can go ahead and look at how those clauses are actually set out and what the important wording is. So we can now move on to my passion and something that I love very much is the administration of deceased estates. Now, this is regulated by the Administration of Estates Act 66 of 1965. What is the process of administering a deceased estate in South Africa? So, several key steps are involved with a deceased estate. First up, obviously, someone has to die. So when someone dies, a family member will go to either a lawyer or a financial institution, and they will go and see if there is a will somewhere, or if they don't know if there's a will, they will initially go to a lawyer and say, my parent died, what is the next step? So then in this consultation, the lawyer will go and gather certain documents from the family members in order to report the estate at the Master of the High Court. First up, we will submit a death certificate. And then we will submit the original will. Now I've now spoken about what if we don't know that there is a will somewhere. So they didn't go to a financial institution and say, I know my parent has a will with you. They went to a lawyer, and most lawyers can also actually draft your will and keep it in safekeeping. But if that is not the case, and we don't know if a will is drafted or if there's a valid will in place, we actually go ahead and we first report the estate as intestate, which means that there is no valid will. And then later, when the letters of executorship is issued and we can go ahead and administer the estate, when we send our various instructions to the various institutions like banks or financial institutions like where policies are held, they actually go and do their own search for the deceased on their records. And if they pick up that there is a valid will in place with their institution, they sent the current appointed executor a letter informing him that there is actually a will in place, and then that executor then either applies for the person appointed or nominated in the will to renounce as he's already been appointed as the executor, or alternatively the file gets handed over to the actual nominated party, the letters of executorship is cancelled, and the party that has the will in their place, they go ahead and they then continue with the administration of the estate. So that's just a small by added information I wanted you guys to have regarding the will. Now we go on and we see what other documents we need. We've discussed the death certificate, the original will. We need the ID documents. ID documents of who? So the ID document of the person wanting to be appointed as the executor. The ID documents of, if we are now reporting the estate as interstate, the ID documents of the next of kin. So surviving spouse, children. If there's no children, the mom and dad. If there's no mom and dad, the aunts and uncles. So that's the interstate succession. So we lodge those documents. We also lodge the document of the deceased, of course. Then we go on and we consider the next thing. What is the deceased marital status? If the deceased is married, we will obviously submit our marriage certificate. But then we cannot stop there. We also need to consider marital law. Is the person married in community of property, out of community of property, or out of community of property with accrual? If the person is married out of community of property, we need to submit the antenuptial contract. Or what if the person is divorced? Then we also need to lodge a decree of divorce. So now we have our important documents that should be in the family's possession. But we now need to move on to consider what other documents will the master require. The master will require a list of assets and liabilities. So the assets will be included in our inventory where we will say, okay, the person had immovable assets, the person had movable assets, and the person had cash assets. Then if the estate has a value of less than 250,000 Rand, we also have to submit a list of liabilities. Where is the liability held? What is the amount? Because the master needs to consider if there is sufficient funds available in the estate to cover these liabilities if the estate is administered under the Section 18.3 of the Estates Act, which is when an estate has a lower value of 250,000 Rand. Other documents that we need to submit is our reporting documents such as our next of kin affidavit, our death notice, our reporting affidavit, actually, the reporting affidavit isn't really since 2008 necessary anymore. But the master's offices aren't working on the same basis, so they decide on their own whether they need this document. So to ensure that we can get the letters of executorship quicker, we rather submit this document, and this document says that the estate wasn't reported at any other master's office previously. We also submit our marital affidavit, which is the affidavit confirming that what the marital status of the deceased is. Then we need to submit our if there is no will in place, or if the will did not specifically nominate an executor, we need to issue the nomination of executorship document. So the next of kin in terms of the Interstate Succession Act, which is the mom, the dad, the mother, the father, the children, it depends on who is actually still alive at that date. They then go and they nominate someone to be the executor of the estate. Then this nominated person then goes and he actually fills in the J190 if it is an estate with a value of higher than 250,000 Rand. And they submit a document saying that they are happy to accept their nomination and that they will perform their duties in terms of the Estates Act. Or if the estate has a value of less than 250,000 Rand, we need to look at our J155, which is the acceptance of trust or master's instructions for the estate with a value of lower than 250. And then that is all the documents that we need to submit to the master. The master takes these documents, he verifies it, and then he issues our letters of executorship, or alternatively, our letters of authority, depending on the value of the estate. So once we've received these two documents, we can now lawfully proceed with the administration of the estate. If a letters of authority was issued, the letters of authority will actually have a section at the bottom saying what the appointed executor needs to do. If there is assets, the appointed executor needs to collect all of the assets and settle the liabilities, and that is the end of their scope as executor. Then once that is finalized, they can go ahead and request discharge. But what if the estate has a letters of executorship, meaning a value of more than 250,000 Rand? Then our next step, once we've received the letters of executorship, is actually to place a Section 29 advertisement. Now, this advertisement, and if I say now, if I refer to different sections, I'm referring to the Administration of Estates Act 66 of 1965. So, the Section 29 advertisement is a notice to the creditors and debtors of the estate that the executor has now been appointed and they can formally submit their claims against the estate. So this Section 29 advertisement must be placed in a local newspaper in the area where the person resided the past 12 years before their date of death, 12 months, before their date of death. And it also needs to be placed in the Government Gazette, which is available across the whole of South Africa. Now, when we place our advertisement in the Government Gazette, we do this by using the form called the J193, which is literally just a form showing the deceased particulars as well as the executor's particulars. Now, in terms of Section 29, once the creditors has been called to lodge the claim and claims against the estate, they have a period of 30 days to lodge the claim. So literally, if you place the advertisement on the 1st of March, at the 31st of March, claims will no longer be accepted because they had their 30 days. But what happens? Do you literally just accept the claims once it's been submitted? So say, for instance, a family member comes to you and say, okay, you know what? I submit my claim on the 17th of March. Here is my letter saying that the deceased owed me 100,000 Rand. Do you then just accept this claim? No. We need, in our fiduciary duty as the executor of the estate, we need to verify the claims. Now, Parties that submitted their claims within the 30-day period has 3 months from that date then to now provide us with sufficient proof of their claim. If we have sufficient proof of the claim, sufficient proof will be proof that the deceased had a loan account, statements of account, an affidavit signed by the deceased prior to death showing that he had an amount owned, etc. So if they have these information, we verified the claims, we can now go ahead and we can draft our L&D account. Now, here's a small tip. You are not allowed to draft your L&D account if the 30 days has not lapsed, or alternatively, if you have not appropriately verified your claims. Now we go on to other information. So I just want to say now, I'm trying to work from the top to the bottom of the steps that need to be followed, but I'm also going to jump around to give you additional information. So the L&D account comes much later. I just wanted to give you some additional information. So conjointly, when we place our Section 29 advertisement, we also need to open an estate-like bank account for the estate. So we cannot take the money that comes from different creditors in the debtors in this estate. So for instance, we have a creditor at Absa Bank and we now say, I know we've got 12,000 Rand in that account, please pay it into my account. No. Every single deceased estate has their own specific deceased estate like bank account. So the creditors will pay the amount into that specific account. Now we have then we also have to notify SARS that the person is deceased, and we update the deceased tax affairs. So for instance, we submit outstanding tax returns, we submit our L&D account, all of that information in order for us to get our DEC letter from SARS at the end of the estate administration process, which is our deceased estate compliance letter. This is a requirement from the Master's Office before we can close our file off. Then we also need to collect, protect, and value our assets. I love this sentence. It flows so nice off the tongue. Collect, protect, and value all assets. How do we do this? First off, if we have assets available, we need to send our letters of instruction to the debtors. So for instance, as I explained, Absa has money. We send our formal letter of instruction with our supporting documents saying, we are the executor. We know these funds with your estate, with your institution. Here is our banking details. Please proceed to pay the amount into our estate-like bank account and provide us with proof of the asset at date of death and the current funds available. That is our collection. But what about protection? This one is a very nuanced situation. This is really depending on how your beneficiaries get along. If your beneficiaries don't get along, and you know there will be, there's going to be disputes later on, we need to ensure that the assets are properly protected. How? For instance, the house. Is someone currently living in the house and will be able to look after the house? Is that person paying occupational rent? Because obviously we're protecting further assets. We are making more money from the beneficiaries with occupational rent. For a car, and also is the property insured? And then for a car, the car cannot be used now. We cannot drive around with the car unless the car is insured and the parties are on the policy schedule reflecting that they can use the vehicle. Is the vehicle in someone's possession that will actually look after the vehicle? Or alternatively, if there's more than one beneficiary, we take that vehicle into our possession. So it's expensive being an executor of estate. We need to have storage available for these vehicles. We also need to ensure that these vehicles don't require new batteries. So we have to start it every now and again. We have to literally get the cars moving. We have to protect the asset so that when we hand over the asset to the beneficiary, that it is exactly in the same condition it was at the date of death. Okay, protecting our assets. And then we value our assets. How do you value your assets? Well, first and foremost, if there is minor beneficiaries involved, we need to have 2 sworn valuations from reputable firms for the immovable property. It's required by SARS as well as the Master's Office. And then also valuating the vehicles. We literally take the vehicle to a dealership. We tell them it's a deceased estate and we ask them to give us a proper valuation on their letterhead of the value. Okay, and that's literally protecting, collecting, and valuing our assets. Then we also need to certain urgent expenses and we need to apply for death benefit claims. What are urgent expenses? Urgent expenses are expenses that accrue interest. So, for instance, secured assets, a bond account registered against an immovable property. Unsecured assets like credit cards, stuff like that, you can actually send a letter of instruction to the parties to tell them not to accrue any additional interest on this account, to place it into a suspense account. So that then also ensures that we don't have to pay additional interest after the person died for our claims. But it is the institution's prerogative to decide whether or not they will actually accept the waiving of these accrued interest. If they don't, it's better and there is funds available to settle the claims that accrue interest quicker. Also, we need to continue with the administration of the claims. For instance, any amount with, if someone is living in the immovable property, we need to ensure that Eskom is paid, that the municipality is paid. Because why do we do that? Why can't we just let these amounts rest until such that we can go ahead and transfer these properties? Because the municipality and Eskom has the right to switch off the electricity. Now, if the electricity is switched off, it poses a risk for the security of the immovable property. So it's better if there's funds available for you guys to go ahead and continue paying administrative costs like our levy accounts, water, electricity rates, and taxes. Non-urgent expenses will be, for instance, if there is a medical account with the medical aid, or if a beneficiary of the estate submits a claim for funeral expenses, stuff like that, because it's not an urgent expense that can accrue interest and in the end cause a further liability for our estate. Now, the big one for deceased estate that you will also have to write your competency-based exam on when you are doing your articles is our liquidation and distribution account. Now, I'm not going to go into very much detail with our L&D account because I know all of you guys, or most of you guys, will want to write your competency-based exams. So when you do that, you sufficiently prepare on exactly what is in an L&D account. So, and also, L&D accounts doesn't necessarily have to be as intimidating as people tell you that it is, especially when you're already practicing, because we make use of programs such as Legal-Ease to draft our L&D accounts. So literally all of the information is already included in your Legal-Ease program. For instance, the 5 different accounts. And you literally just go and add your information specific to your deceased estate into the program and it drafts your L&D account for you. So, but when you do your competency-based exams, you actually learn how to do it by hand. So now what is the L&D account? Once all the claims in favor and against the estate have been verified and collected, we prepare our liquidation and distribution account, which details all the assets and liabilities in this estate, and also how these assets and liabilities is going to be distributed to the heirs or the legatees of the estate. Another account that includes in the L&D is our income account, post date of death, our admin expenses, and our estate duty calculations. So once we've now drafted our liquidation and distribution account with our 5 accounts, which is our liquidation, our distribution, our cash statement, our capitalization statement and our estate duty statement, we can go ahead and submit this liquidation and distribution account together with the supporting documents. What are the supporting documents to our L&D account? We've now already have the first document, which is literally the account, but what else? We need to prove to the master every single asset, every single liability. So for instance, remember when I said we are collecting, protecting, and valuing our assets? Now this comes into play. We are literally going that way we valued our assets, asking the institutions for the value as at date of death, going and getting our sworn valuations of the properties, getting our valuations for the vehicles, all of that, verifying the claims with the debtors of the creditors of the state, all of that we take, add it to our L&D account as annexures, and we go ahead and we submit it to the master's office for his approval. The master then reviews all of these documents that we've submitted, and he either approves the account or more likely he queries the account. So he will send you a letter which states, okay, I see you've done this, but I am unsure why you made provision for, say, for instance, municipal clearance figures. Why did you make provision for municipal clearance figures where I already see a claim from the municipality? Now, this is supposed to be obvious to the master's office because, quick by sideline quote, when we have a deceased estate and we do the transfer of the movable property, you have your claim against the estate, which is the balance on the municipal account now. And then we also have our provisional claim, which will be calculated 3 months in advance, which we call our clearance figures. That the municipality is a requirement from the municipality and the deeds office in order to transfer this property to the beneficiaries. So we have to include 2 lines in our L&D account for this. The master might query this, and you literally explain exactly what I just explained to the master back, why certain information is in your L&D account. If you did something wrong and you know it's wrong, for instance, you accidentally noted the wrong ID number for the deceased, or you didn't include the marital status, or whatever the case might be, you just tell the master, we are sorry, here is an amended L&D account reflecting the changes that you requested. Once again, with all of your annexures, the master looks at that account once again, and then they approve it. Now moving on to section 35. Section 35 is the advertisement that we place to notify all the debtors and creditors in the estate that the L&D account was drafted. They then get an opportunity to look at the L&D account. So you place an advertisement in the local newspaper and the government gazette, exactly what we did initially with the Section 29 advertisement. We now place a Section 35 advertisement notifying them our account is drafted, ready, accepted, it's lying open for inspection. They then go, the creditors, and they visit the local magistrate's court where you also have to let it lie for inspection, and your master's office. They ask for a copy of the L&D account, they view it, and they ensure that their claim that you approved and verified is actually in our L&D account. If it is and they are happy, no one objects against the L&D account, we go ahead and we get our no objection certificate from the magistrate court confirming that we may now distribute the estate. So once this period has prescribed, we can get approval from the master's office with this magistrate certificate showing that no objection was lodged, that we can now distribute the estate. So this is basically the final administration. We go ahead, we pay all the creditors we've not yet paid, and we get our paid up letters, which is literally just a letter from the person saying, okay, there's no funds available, or the account was closed, no further amounts payable. We get we pay all of the remaining administrative costs, like the executors' fees, master's fees, everything like that, any taxes that is still outstanding, and then we can do distribution to the heirs when we can transfer our movable property. Now, the final reporting to the master happens where we submit proof that all of the heirs received their inheritance, all of the debts has been settled, all of the immovable properties has been transferred, and SARS issued their clearance. Then, once we've showed this proof to the master, we apply for the master's discharge of executorship. So literally that you will no longer be the executor because there's nothing for you to administer anymore. The master issues a discharge certificate and you can go ahead and close your file. Now, just a quick, I'm not going to take too much time with this, but just a quick heads up with common issues that we can expect with deceased estates. And if I mean common, I mean literally every single estate. So you have to have hair on your teeth when you are an administrator. Because what if documents are missing? Remember, when we have a deceased estate, the beneficiaries might not have been very close with the person that died. So they might not know where to go and look if there is a marriage certificate or a original registration certificate for the vehicles or a original title deed for the immovable property. So then if these documents are missing, we need to literally go and ask the various departments where it could have been held, like the traffic department, the deeds office, home affairs. We need to go ask for duplicate original documents in this regard. Also, air disputes. Beneficiaries like to dispute the value of the estate, why one person is getting more than another person, why certain decisions are made of the executor. You need to have the patience to explain to them the legal standing of why you're making certain decisions. And also, you need to have the patience of working with them, understanding why they are frustrated. They don't necessarily understand that it can take long for an estate to be finalized. There can be delays. Remember, we're working with government institutions. The master's office may take long to issue the letters of executorship. The municipality may take long to issue clearance figures. SARS may take forever to verify the documents. It can be a very long, tedious process to administer a deceased estate. You need to be aware of this. You need to be aware that you will only get your executor's fee maybe after 2 years. Are you ready to put in 2 years for this file only to get paid at the end? And then also maintenance claims. How do you calculate maintenance claims for dependents or surviving spouses or life partners? What do you need? So there's certain issues that you can expect and that you need to be well prepared for. And this, I can assure you, comes with time. As you administer deceased estates for periods, stuff like this come up and you learn to handle it on the job. Now we move on to the importance of wills. Wills is the foundation of it all. What is a will exactly? A will is a legal document that expresses a person's final wishes. It is governed by the Wills Act 7 of 1953. Now, the requirements of a valid will. We all know the Wills Act specifically states the requirements for a valid will. The will must be in writing. Each page must be initialed by the testator as well as the witnesses. And also, at the end of the will, all of them have to sign in full. It has to be properly dated. So there's various requirements in a will that we need to consider. We also need to consider who signs the will. Was the person forced to draft this will? Can you see that clearly that the stipulations in the will doesn't make sense in comparison with the actual wishes of this testator? Also, when we say who signs the will, the witnesses that signs the will cannot be heirs nominated in the will, or the executor, or the testator cannot also sign as a witness. So literally, third-party people like a neighbor, someone else in the office, anyone that's not literally were nominated somewhere in your will or named, can be witnesses. Now, why do we have to draft will? Most people, especially young people like us, think, why is it necessary? I don't necessarily have assets yet. I'm still young. No. Every single person, no matter what their assets look like, no matter what their estate looks like, no matter how many children they have, or no matter whether they think they need or do not need a will, every single person needs a will. If you don't have one, you are welcome to contact me. We need to get this drafted and sorted for you as soon as possible. So, we draft wills to avoid intestacy rules. Now, intestacy is when a deceased didn't have a will, and the will will then, the estate will then be distributed in accordance with interstate succession rules that is set out in the Interstate Succession Act 81 of 1987. Why do we not want to follow intestacy rules? Because then the law decides who inherit, not you. The distribution might not reflect the deceased wishes. For example, you might have a long-term partner that you've been living with for a long period of time, but they're not really married, so now they're not going to receive anything. Or you might be very close with your niece or nephew, but you also have children. Now your niece and nephew won't get anything. So we need to ensure that a will is drafted to reflect your wishes and not the wishes of the state. And it can result in unexpected or unfair outcomes, especially in blended families, where, for instance, where you have stepchildren but you consider them as your own, or where the dependents are estranged. For instance, you do have children but you have nothing in common with them. They don't live with you. You don't want them to own anything from your estate, but they will if we don't have a valid will in place. So having a will ensures your assets go to the people you choose, not what is defaulted by law. Also, you can nominate someone, a guardian, for your minor children in your will. If you don't have a will, the master appoints a guardian for you. So a guardian can be an aunt or an uncle that you don't necessarily want to look after your children. So when you have a will, you can stipulate in your will, I want my best friend to look after my children and be their guardian and be the trustee, whatever the case might be. So the Master of the High Court appoints a guardian based on what seems appropriate, which might not align with your wishes or your child's best wishes. And also, family disputes may arise if you don't have a guardian. So now the master approves someone, and then the family decides, oh, you know what? I know the master appointed you. I'm not happy with this. So I'm going to be the one coming every day to your house and creating unnecessary stress for that child. So by naming a guardian in our will, we ensure that the parent, which is you, the testator, have control over who raises your child. It gives the court and the master clear direction of what you want for your child and introduces uncertainty and conflict at an already traumatic time for the child and the extended family. Next up, a well-drafted will also reduces family conflict by clearly outlining the deceased's wishes. It can also preempt disputes by explaining unusual decisions. For instance, why one child will now only get 100 Rand and another child gets 1,000 Rand. So your will stipulates, I'm giving 100 Rand to one child because he did not look after me when I was ill, and that's why my other child gets 1,000 Rand. Specifically stipulating reasons why you are doing certain things in your will. It also helps reduce legal challenges and delays. So your child that now only got 100 Rand in terms of the will, he now can't go and challenge it because it's clearly stipulated in your will exactly why you are bequeathing a certain asset to one child and not to another. So without a will, beneficiaries might argue over entitlements, delay finalization of the estate, and one thing that I see time and time again, it also causes lasting damage to your family members. Children, sisters, and brothers that were close before the person died suddenly no longer even speak to each other. A well-drafted will can avoid this. A will can also allow for estate planning and tax efficiency. So if we strategically draft our will, we can ensure that we reduce estate duty by specifically bequeathing, for instance, your estate to your surviving spouse. A surviving spouse is exempted from estate duty because there's a 3.5 million exemption for one spouse and 3.5 million for another spouse. So just a side note. And if you bequeath your estate to a public benefit organization, so like for instance, uh, um, a child's home or SPCA, whatever the case might be, because to charities or religious institutions also are exempted from estate duty. And then trust planning, especially for minor children or vulnerable beneficiaries. We can submit or include a clause in our will that stipulates that a trust must be created for certain parties like minor children or special needs beneficiaries. If they won't be able to look after the assets you are bequeathing to them, a trust can be created so that these assets can be administered on their behalf. It also avoids forced realization of assets. So if your will specifically say, I don't want to sell my family home, and you say it in your will, the executor can't go and sell your family home. So if you didn't have a clause like that in your will and there's not sufficient funds available, executor has the right to sell your assets in order to create sufficient funds. When you have a stipulation like that in your will, another avenue must be explored by the executor to create sufficient funds. So when you ensure that all your assets are placed in a trust, which is the trust laws I now mentioned, it protects them from creditors or delays inheritance until the beneficiary reaches maturity. Now I've now discussed very broadly for an hour. To me, it didn't feel like an hour, but I see now I'm almost at the end of my time. So we are now going to move over to our closing thoughts. If you have taken anything from this lecture today, I want it to be this. You don't need to wear a robe in court or be on TV to make a difference. Helping a widow understand her rights, protecting a child's inheritance, or ensuring that a person's final wishes are honored. These are some of the most noble things that you can do with your law degree. This is why I have a passion for estates. It's not just going to the office and doing your work. You are helping people here. So I just also want to congratulate each and every one of you for investing your time in this lecture today and also for investing your time with Liz in her mentorship program. I can see that you are clearly already ahead of the curve and great things will come from you guys. I can promise you this. You are putting in the work, you will reap the rewards. So if estates and trust interest you, I encourage you to reach out to professionals in the field. You can do this via LinkedIn. Pop a message to someone that you see specializes in them. Do they have vacation work available? Will they be your mentor? Ask for vacation work. You will see LinkedIn is my best friend. If you guys see how many posts are posted on LinkedIn regarding vacation work at one of the big 5 law firms, you guys need to jump at these opportunities. Internships. Read up on case law. Like, get ahead of the curve. And then build your niche early. So just to, okay, guys, I want to switch off my share screen so that I can look at you guys now. Okay. So I want to explain to you guys that you have to build your niche early. For instance, I'm going to give you a little bit of backstory about me. I started my LLB degree in I think 2019. I started with my LLB degree. I literally immediately started working for a law firm. I know not everyone is privileged like that, but I decided, you know what? I'm just going to apply. I don't care if I have to mop the floors, if I have to wash the dishes. I want to get my foot in the door. And I did. And then I was lucky enough to be in a firm with deceased estates that I wanted to specialize in. And I listened and I helped. I asked where I can help. I read up about case law. I read the Estates Administration Act. And then I started posting on LinkedIn about my passion of deceased estates. What did I learn today in office? What was interesting to me? I built my niche, I built my clientele up early. Now, as an admitted attorney, I'm only admitted literally for 1 month, but I've been working in deceased estates for 5 years, well, 6 years now. So for these 6 years, I've built up my clients for, if you would have gone from your LLB account, from your LLB degree, and then started working in a law firm with only 2 years and now getting out after your articles, and you didn't do anything else. You didn't build a niche, you didn't build up your profession. You literally went to your work, did your articles, went back home. After you've done your articles and you are admitted, what next? How are you going to make money? Trust me, this field is literally it's there's a word for it that I can't get now at the tip of my tongue. Saturated. This field is saturated. There's so many. I think I read an article a few days ago that said that every single year 6,000 articles of clerkship is registered at the LPC. So that means after 2 years, there's 6,000 new lawyers walking the streets. How do you make yourself stand out from that? And that's how I did it. I posted on LinkedIn. I made myself look more than I am until I actually now can say that I am specialized now because I put in the additional work. I stepped out of my articles immediately with a well-built client basis for my own account, for my own income. Okay, so that's important for you to do early on. If the sister states is not for you, do the same in another field. Do you want to go into compliance? Start with your RE exams. Do you want to go into litigation? Start reading up on case law. So it's important for you to build your niche early. So that's it from me, guys. Thank you so much for having me. I would love to stay in touch with you guys. I'm going to add well, you guys can see it on the chat anyway. Leshai Swanepoel. Follow me on LinkedIn, pop me a message. If you have any questions, you are welcome to contact me. So that's it. So let's open the floor for some questions. I see no one has raised their hands.
Thank you, Lishe. But we've got some questions on the chat.
Oh,
So,
let's have a look.
Kuto, do you want to come through and ask your question?
Oh, I love this. There's quite a lot of questions.
Good morning. Sorry, I cannot
Morning.
switch on my camera at the
No,
moment.
it's
I'm having
okay.
issues.
It's okay.
But I just mainly wanted to ask, I know when somebody, or at least I'm sure, please correct me if I'm wrong, that when someone passes on without a will, that the spouse is entitled to a child portion. So if the person passes on with a will, can the spouse still claim the child's portion or not?
No. So that is it's a very good question, but that is important why we need to have a division between um, the will and interstate law. So, interstate law, to protect the spouse, we do have our child's portion. If they are married in community of property, the spouse is lucky to also get 50% of the estate with a will or without a will. And then with an interstate estate, they get a child's portion as well, which means that they literally get the same amount as all of the children calculated. Or if there's not sufficient funds in the estate, they get 250,000 rand or a child's portion. If there is a will in place, the surviving spouse gets, and the married in community of property, 50% of the estate that she's entitled to in terms of the marital regime, and then she also gets whatever is stipulated in the will. If nothing is stipulated in the will, meaning that the testator did not leave anything for the wife, the only thing she gets is her 50% that she's entitled to in terms of marital law. So it's very important also to have a good discussion between husband and wife when we draft our wills. It might be that the testator did not necessarily mean to leave out the wife in his will, but he assumed, rightly as Kutso now thought, that anyway she's going to receive a child's portion, so why do I have to include that? Important then to go and see a professional to help you guys draft a well drafted will that actually protects the assets of the deceased or the testator, and also ensure that the wishes is actually fulfilled as they wanted to in the will. Does that answer your question, Kutso?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. So I'm going to start reading up. I don't know if all my chats are up here because I literally see I'm an AI assistant. It's amazing how AI is now taking over. I actually use AI as well. It's a great tool. Just don't misuse it. So I just want to see. Okay, that's Crystal's question. Temba. Temba, would you like to ask your questions, verbalize it, or do you want me to just read it here and answer for you?
I think he said he's having mic issues, so his mic is not working. So I
Um,
believe we can just read through his question on the chat.
I'm so sorry, Temba. It's literally standing there. I think after my hour of speaking, I missed it completely. Okay, so the question is, if a valid will is discovered after the estate has been distributed already, let's say after a year or two, according to interstate succession, what legal remedies are available to enforce the will? This is a great question, but nuanced in South Africa. So what's supposed to happen is, remember when I said that a bond of security is applied for? That also helps us a bit with stuff like this. But I'm going to backtrack a bit and also explain the process that followed. Remember when we said that there's certain things that has to be followed in the Estate Administration Act. For instance, we report the estate, now interstate, because we don't know there's a will. We collect the assets. We inform the public. Remember, the public is informed that there is now an estate, there is an executor, we are going ahead, we're collecting the claims. Then the master goes and he sees the L&D account and he says, okay, I'm happy. No one came forth. I see you collected all the assets, which is your right in terms of the letters of executorship. And you go and you distribute the estate now afterwards. And then what happens next? Remember, we also placed a Section 35 advertisement, once again informing people that we are going to go ahead with distribution. So if you don't come out of the woodworks, what now? So now we go ahead, we distribute, everyone gets their funds. And now what now? Now this comes into play, the legal remedies. There's no legal remedy. So if there is no funds available, there's no funds available. It was distributed. Everyone got their portion in terms of interstate succession. But you can go to the High Court and actually submit an application to the High Court saying, listen, this was the will. Explain your reasonings why the will didn't come out now. Why was the will hidden? Why didn't you come forth during these periods? And then the court can decide. So they can actually go to the various parties. Never happens. Usually it's just thrown out, but they will go to the various parties that received their inheritance and they will ask it back, redistributed in terms of a court order, no longer according to the will, a court order to the various parties. But if the person have,
Okay.
Liz, are you okay? Oh, okay. So if the parties no longer have the funds available, like literally they used it, which was their right in terms of interstate succession law. We've done everything we can possibly do to provide the public with an opportunity to come out of the woodworks. Then the court can then decide to still, okay, say, I understand you were in this will, the will wasn't came out too late. But we now have been able, in terms of hearing the various affidavits from the beneficiaries of interstate succession, of the testator, of the deceased documents that we have in order from the current executor of the estate, and we are able to make a decision for you guys to distribute whatever is left to the various parties. I know it sounds a bit nuanced, but it's really what's going to happen here. The court will, just to recap, either throw out the case because it's been distributed in accordance with the Estates Act and the Interstate Succession Act, or the court can make a decision to say, I understand the situation, because it's obviously what literally the judge has to do. I understand the situation. We have managed, because of the good grace and good faith of the interstate beneficiaries, managed to collect X amount of funds for you guys, and we can distribute it again. So the estate isn't administered again. We're not going to apply for the executor again. The court then makes a decision. So it's no longer in our scope as executors. It's a court decision. But I have seen in previous things that this usually happens before the estate is finalized, and then we can go ahead and literally the one person that's now the nominated executor in the will can take over the file and continue as is. So that's the one question, Temba. And then number two, in cases of death, who do I approach first to know whether the deceased has a will? Good question. So what we do is if you had a good relationship with whoever is now deceased, you will most likely know where they had policies, bank accounts, did they have a will in their house. First things first, you go and you go through the whole house. Wherever they could have hidden important documents, go into their cupboards, sort out the house, go get important documents, and someone keep those documents because we're going to need it later. And then if you can't find a will there, don't now already consider it's interstate. We can also write or call the various institutions that we know in South Africa that does wills. So you can literally call Sanlam, Absa, FNB, call them quickly, explain the situation, check on your records, do you have a will? If they don't have a will, then we move on to the next institution, But we also need to consider that the deceased estate needs to be reported to the master's office within 14 days. So you cannot take your time there. Rather, report the estate as interstate and then still continue your investigation, see if there's a will somewhere. And then if there's no will, obviously we go ahead, or alternatively, if we do finally find a will, the party that's nominated in the will can go ahead and proceed with cancelling the letters of executorship for the interstate estate and getting appointed as the appropriate executor in terms of the will and continue with the administration. So there's not a database where we can go and type in the deceased details to see if there's a will somewhere. There's unfortunately not something like that in South Africa. We literally have to do our due diligence and call the institutions to see if there is a will somewhere. Yes, Oratile, I will definitely share the presentation. Well, it's very short, but I will share it with Liz. And then
We have a
yes,
hand.
I see. You can go ahead.
Good morning. Thank you for the beautiful session.
Oh, thank you so
I'm
much. You're welcome.
yeah, I'm Mabore. I just have a question based on a certain video that I saw. Maybe you can create like better clarity because as someone who studied law, I still don't have an idea on the practical side of it. And essentially, this person was explaining that their parents planned basically the father planned his estate whilst he was still alive. So he made a will that stated that he wants his money that is in, those life policies, the life cover policy. Yeah, he said he wants the money from the life cover to be in a trust account, to go into a trust account once he's laid. And then that trust will be the one distributing the money to the children based on certain conditions that they should fulfill. How does that actually work? And is it true? Like, can you actually do something like that? And who
Yes,
helps with such planning?
absolutely. Everything that you mentioned is in accordance with law. It's correct. So, first, starting at the end of the question, how do we approach someone to help you with this? This is called estate planning. So, you approach someone that specializes in estate planning to help you. To consider stuff like capital gains tax at the end, donation tax, for instance, with the life policy, specifically the life policy, we need to now consider the life policy. You cannot mention in your will or bequeath something in your will that's not yours to bequeath. But it's your policy then. Literally, you are the owner of the policy. Why can't you bequeath your policy somewhere? If your policy has a nominated beneficiary on the policy schedule, so for instance, when you applied for your policy, and it is the best to do this, I'm going to explain this now. But if you on your policy schedule nominated, say for instance, your wife as the beneficiary of your policy, that policy does not form part of the estate. It's a living estate asset going to the new beneficiary, the new owner, falls outside of the scope of the estate. If it's included in the will, you literally write an small declaration at the bottom of your L&D account stating you bequeathed your life policy in section or paragraph 1.1 of your will to the trust, but we now noted from the policy schedule that this policy has a nominated beneficiary. As such, it's not an estate asset to be bequeathed, doesn't form part of the estate, so it gets removed. Okay, so that's number one. Number two is you asked, is this right? Can you do this? Absolutely, you can do this. So if there's no beneficiary nominated on your policy, You can write in your will, I want to bequeath my policy to my testamentary trust that will be created in this will. So in your same will that you now bequeath your life policy to a trust, you have to have trust specifications in your will. So you are going to say, my trust will be created when I die. My trust name will be this. My trustees will be these people. I want my beneficiaries of the trust to be these people. And then the trustees, it's now a different entity completely from the deceased estate. So we have our estate-led account and we have our trust account. When we finalize our deceased estate part, we go and we transfer our funds to our trust account if there's other bequests in our will. Alternatively, we already create our trust because we see in our will that that is our duty as the executor to go ahead and inform these trustees to submit the trust documents. They create a trust for you guys. The institution where the policy is held pays over the funds to a trust, and then once again it is a trust asset, but it's bequeathed now to them. So it's a state asset bequeathed now to the trust, and now it gets administered by the trust in the future. And the beneficiaries on the trust can be different from the beneficiaries nominated in the will because it's two separate entities. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does make sense to me now. I get it. Thank you.
Do you have a follow-up question, or are you happy with that explanation?
No, your explanation was very clear. Thank
Okay,
you.
perfect. You're welcome. So
Okay,
let's
Licia, we've got one question in the chats. If
yes,
a
I
person is
see.
presumed dead, is the same procedure followed when it comes to their assets? Is there a waiting period before they distribute their assets?
Yes, very, very good question. If a person is presumed dead, we obviously have to go to the police and we have to report this person as presumed dead. Then the police have, I think I'm speaking under correction here. I have to look at the act again, but it's not the Estates Act. It's another act. But I think it's like 7 years or 10 years. It's a long period. You have to wait for this person to come out of the woodworks again. If this person doesn't come out of the woodworks and the police has done their investigation for that period of I think it's 7 years, for 7 years, and no one has come out, the person hasn't come out of the woodworks anymore, it is then declared as officially dead. You get a death certificate from Home Affairs, and then only can you go ahead and report the estate and distribute the estate in terms of what I explained previously. So no, you can't do it before before the end of the waiting period. You literally have to wait your full 7 or 10 years, I can't remember, your full period until the police officially declares this person as dead, and then only can you go ahead and distribute the assets in terms of the Estates Act. And then we can go on to DM Mabasa.
Good morning, Lishay.
Morning.
Thank you so much for the beautiful presentation.
You're welcome.
Thank you. My question is, what happens if the deceased was married in community of property? Then they also have a will. They've indicated in their will that so and so, a sibling or someone, is going to be, I'm not sure whether it's the right word, an executor or something of their will. What happens then? Does the wife automatically becomes the person who's going to be in charge of the estate, or what do you do in that instant?
All of these questions are such good questions. I love it. No. So the most important thing that we need to consider is our will. So if the will doesn't have out of the scope of what is considered legal in South Africa, we need to follow the provisions of the will. For instance, yes, you can have a wife, you can be married in community of property, absolutely. That does not have anything to do with what is specified in the will. So if you, for instance, let's take me and my husband. Let's say we are married in community of property, and I decide in my will I am nominating my best friend as the executor of the estate. But remember, I'm married in community of property now. I'm nominating my best friend as my executor of the estate, and she is somehow my beneficiary as well. So my whole estate must go to my best friend. What is my husband's legal position? The only legal position he has, because there's a valid will, is we are married in community of property. He's entitled to 50% of my estate. That's that. The rest, absolutely, we follow what is noted in the will. So my best friend will be the nominated executor. She has the duty and the responsibility and the privilege to do exactly in my estate what she pleases, because it's her duty as the executor. My husband only gets his 50%, and the rest goes to whoever is nominated in my estate, in my will, as beneficiaries. So no legal position other than her marriage. Does that make sense? Okay, great stuff. We're moving over to a question we got here. Can a family house be placed under a trust? Absolutely, it can. So it's actually the best thing to do. Yeah, I have to say, in South African law, they just came out a new court case that specifically applies to family houses, and we've seen various cases here where, remember, in African law, like customary law, we have what is known as family houses that's registered in one person's name. For instance, the father. But it's a family house, which means the brothers, the sisters, the uncles, the aunts, the whoever forms part of the family, they are also entitled to the family house. To protect that in South African law, because remember, customary law is very nuanced in South Africa. You literally, with customary law, have to, if it's not specifically stated in the Customary Law Act, you have to go to apply to the court for provision, like for their declaration and order, how to proceed with customary law, like how to perform that. Okay, so for instance, with this specific family house situation, our best bet to protect our family house is in our will to say, I want my family house to be bequeathed to this trust that will be created in terms of my will. And in your will your trust stipulations that we have in our will, we will specifically say, my house will be a family house. It may not be sold. Every single member of my family that is linked to me by blood, just an example, linked to me by blood, will be entitled to be a beneficiary of this immovable property, which means that that property remains in the trust for the rest of your family's lives, and every single family member is a beneficiary listed in your trust deed, and they can go ahead and own the house, run the house, administer whatever needs to administer, pay the municipal statement, everything like that, from their scope as number one, trustees, number two, the beneficiaries of the trust. That makes sense to you? I think it's Nomzamo.
I think it does. I think it does. So to be mindful of time, we've got 5 minutes left. Is there any question? One more question?
Okay, it seems that it is.
Kuzo?
Sorry, just one more question.
Yes.
Which would be better between a trust and a curatorship?
Okay. So curatorship is only, you apply for curatorship if a person is not able to look after their financial assets at all, ever. Okay, so a curatorship cannot end unless you apply to the High Court for the curatorship to end. So literally, it's a completely other ballgame. You literally can't say in your will, I want my beneficiary to be placed under curatorship. You can't. Okay, only the court can apply, or a court order can say someone needs to be under curatorship, so a curator is appointed for that person. It's not us that can do that as our testators, as executors, as anyone like that. Only the court can do that. If a beneficiary in your will is already under curatorship, okay, then the curator Well, the beneficiary will still be the beneficiary, but the curator already creates a trust, not a trust, like a bank account that he then has all of the assets of the person. It's literally like an estate, basically, account for your person under curatorship. It gets paid out into his benefits, get paid on under that curatorship account, and then the curator then administers his benefit in terms of the will. So he can only get whatever amount the curator deems necessary for his survival. So it's not what we do. What we do is we do a trust. If we want to protect our beneficiaries' assets, we create a trust, and the trustee acts as a curator, and he also administers the funds until, what the good thing is with a trust, you as the testator can actually go ahead and say in your trust deed, I want my trust to be I can't remember the English word. We call it keer uit, like end the trust at the beneficiary's age of 25 years. With the curatorship, it doesn't end unless you have a court order. So that is the difference between a curatorship, that is a court order, and a trust created in terms of a deceased estate.
Thank you very
Thank you,
much.
Lishe.
You're
We've got
welcome.
2 more questions, I think, at the chats.
Yes, and I think we've only got time for these last 2, but let's try. So if our deceased is declared insolvent, okay, and they died with or without a will, and it happens that after the creditors get all their claims, leaving the insolvent estate without any assets left, does that mean that yes. So in an insolvent estate, okay, just to explain, let's quickly define an insolvent estate. An insolvent estate is where the liabilities exceed the assets. Okay, so when we administer an insolvent estate, it gets administered in conjunction with the Estates Act and the Insolvency Act. So what means is everything that is available now, all the assets, houses, cars, money, it gets liquidated. So now we only work with cash, and then all of the creditors, we go and we say, okay, we have now, after we've liquidated everything, we've got 5 million. Our creditors have claims against the state of 10 million. We go ahead and we calculate pro rata the amounts that we can pay every single creditor in considering their preferred status as creditor, for instance, secured asset, secured liability, stuff like that. We calculate it, and in terms of it's section 34 that we work with in insolvent estates. We go and we submit the letter to the creditor saying, okay, this is the proposed division. Are you happy with this? They go ahead, they say yes. We draft the L&D account. Once that is finalized, we send a letter again saying, okay, L&D account is approved. These are the assets, the amounts we can pay every single one of you. Once that is done, we close the estate. So in an insolvent estate, dependents, they don't get anything because there's nothing to give. Then Oratila said, what about the clause that stipulates that an immovable property is only limited for 2 generations? Okay, let me read this again. What about the clause that stipulates that an immovable property is only limited for 2 generations? This is okay. So you mean you want to bequeath your immovable property to a trust as a family house. So the trust is a family trust, but it will only be for 2 generations, meaning your children and your grandchildren. You literally stipulate in your trust deed that after your children and your grandchildren have become the beneficiaries or have reached an age of majority, it ends with them. So the great grandchildren, they won't get benefit from the family house. The family house will stop there, and after this date, the trustees must go to the deeds office and actually apply for the change of ownership from the immovable property to the 2nd generation family member. So the trust donates the immovable property to the 2nd generation family members, and it gets transferred as such. So that is in terms of what states in our trust deed, how we can do that. And number two, the deeds officer proved that. That is a clause in our title deed. Then we set a clause in our title deed mentioning that after these second generation family members have lived in this house and it ended with them, the house will then be transferred to the second generation. So it stops with them. Or alternatively, the house must be sold and the proceeds will be distributed to the second generation family members. So the third generation will have no benefit from the property. And then, okay, Liz, do we have time to take the next questions? Because this is a very interesting session, and I think people are quite interested to get their answers. I don't mind staying a bit longer. It's all up to you.
Okay, we can take some time. It's okay, Lishe. I think someone raised their hands. Do you still want to ask your question, Kaiso?
Yes, ma'am, I can ask. Hello, Lishe. How are you?
Hello. Good and you?
Good. Thank you for the presentation. So, this is so interesting. First of all, this is an interesting field. So, my question is, I don't know if you have covered the question, right? But my question is, say for example, in cases where you are married, right? Say in community of property or out of community of property. So, okay, let's say in community of property. Let's just put it that way. And then your husband doesn't actually put you in their will. Are you able to then claim after that when you find out that you're not there in their will? Are you able to claim?
Yes, I've covered this question, but I will quickly recap. So if you are married in community of property and you're not a beneficiary of the will, the only claim you have to the estate is your marital claim. So when you are married in community of property, you are entitled to half of the estate in terms of your marital regime. The other half of the estate will be administered in terms of the stipulations of the will. Are you happy with that?
Yes, thank you. I got that. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Let's move on to this question. And a follow-up question to this. I know there is certain property under the Insolvency Act that does not fall into the estate. So since there is property that is excluded from the estate, yes, after the estate gets sequestered, does that property get divided amongst the okay. So property, what he means, property that falls out of the deceased estate is retirement annuities, policies that has nominated beneficiaries, stuff like that. Okay, so that forms out of the scope of the estate. Companies, no, companies do fall under the estate. My apologies for that. If you are the what is that, director of a company, your portion of the company also forms part of your estate. But let's say the policies and stuff like that is asked there. No, it doesn't form part of the estate. It also doesn't form part of your insolvent estate. So that is handled completely separately. That's why I previously said it's very important actually to nominate beneficiaries to protect your estate. You nominate your beneficiaries on policies, so it doesn't form part of your estate, and you create a inter vivos trust now. Move your assets into your inter vivos trust, so when you die, there is no estate, okay, because everything's already in your living trust. So your question there is answered in terms of if it doesn't form part of the estate. For instance, the policies, whatever has a nominated beneficiary, any of your trust assets, anything like that, then it doesn't form part of the insolvent estate and your creditors can't claim anything from those assets. To add on to this question, what would happen if someone has been sequestered but isn't rehabilitated and some credits still haven't been paid? What could happen if the insolvent received a gift? Okay. If you are under sequestration, okay, and you haven't been declared solvent again by the court, any single thing that you own forms part of your estate. Okay, everything that you get, money, whatever it forms part of your estate. And unfortunately, creditors can lay claim on it, even if you want to keep it. So don't give anything to anyone who is insolvent. That is also why when we do when you do the administration of the estate, you have to declare in your L&D account that every single person that's nominated is actually solvent. If they are insolvent, then you have to not give benefit to the person in their personal capacity, you have to ask for their curator's details, banking details, and transfer the assets in the will, in the estate to your curator bank account. You can't keep it in your personal capacity if you haven't been rehabilitated by the court yet. So I think that is all the questions that I've covered. It seems everyone is happy. Liz, are you happy?
I am so happy. Thank you once again, Licia, for coming through and giving us a wonderful presentation and engaging session. I can see that the students or my mentees had really fun today. But if there's any more question, it's fine. They can bring it through and then I'll pass it on to you. Then we can share the answers to them. But once again, thank you guys for coming through today on a Saturday morning and having fun. If there's no more questions, I believe it's the end of our session. Thank you once again, Lishe. Enjoy your weekend. We'll talk.
Thank you,
Me and
guys.
you talk.
Absolutely. Thank you guys so much. Have a lovely weekend. And just a little side note, you guys can follow me on LinkedIn because I do post very important information about estates there.
Don't
That's
worry,
it.
I'll share your link.
Thank you.
I'll
I just
I'll
followed
share
you
your link
now.
with them. Okay.
Perfect.
That's
Thank you
nice.
guys.
Thank you
Bye.
guys. Bye.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Bye bye.
Bye.